right? Because do we feed, are we going to feed, how do you define a calf, right? So what would make this title even more accurate would probably be adding pre-weaned, right? So before those calves are weaned, should you offer them some sort of forage? Should you offer them hay? That's the big question, right? Now, how many of you here have heard you should not feed hay to calves during pre-weaning phase? Right? That has been the golden rule for quite a while, right? You don't do it. Okay? Now, it's interesting though, because today we'll start out and we'll talk about, just real quickly, some of the changes that you see, that we've seen over the years when it comes to forages and pre-weaned calf diets. Okay? And then from there, we're going to talk about, how did that come about? How did we go to all of a sudden do not do it? Just flat out don't feed hay to pre-weaned calves. So how did we get there? What kind of research came out? Why did that come out as an important thing to not do? And then we're going to look at some of the current research that came out. And when I say current, I mean current. We're talking 2015, 2016 data saying, maybe we need to reconsider this. And what are those implications? And then finally we'll end with a couple take-home messages. So what are those key things that you want to take in your back pocket with you when you leave here today? So over the years, it's interesting because it was not always like that. Okay? It was the golden rule was not always that you should not feed hay to pre-weaned calves. Interesting, because for as much of a hard, fast rule it's become, it's actually interesting to think that just in 1991 and 1992, about 50% of the producers in the United States offered hay within the first 2 weeks. Okay? Now, 1991, 1992 really wasn't all that long ago, if you think about it, right? So then what happened? Well, and actually, I know at least some of you were at the talk yesterday where we had the NOMS data that was presented and some of the 2014 data. And it's interesting because now we're looking at more about 20 to 30% producers offer hay during the pre-weaning phase, okay? But when they offer it, we have this range of 30 to 58 days versus 14 days, okay? So we're seeing this transition. 1991, I actually, when I found this number, I was a little surprised because I thought, wow, 50%, half of all the producers were giving hay in those first 2 weeks. That was actually a little bit of a shocker. And now we're looking at a month to 2 months. So why did we ever decide to limit forages and calf diets? Why did we ever decide to not, that we shouldn't give calves in the pre-weaning phase hay? How did that come about? Do any of you guys know? Because we're told not to do it, right? But why, right? See, I'm a bit of a pistol, right? Because if someone tells me don't do something, right, I want to know why. I was that annoying kid, right? The teacher would say, don't stand on that table. And I'd say, why? Right? So then the question comes out, why? Why shouldn't we feed hay to these calves? And then it also poses a question, so you think about it, and Nicole and I were talking about this morning. So if calves were raised out on pasture, and they would have access to, grass and whatever's out there on the pasture, they would be consuming some of that. Now, I don't know what the numbers would be on how much of it, but they would probably nibble on it, right? So there's some disadvantages. We'll start there. There are reasons why people said, you know what? You probably should not feed hay to calves, okay? In that pre-weaning phase. You probably shouldn't do it. Wait until they're weaned, then give them that access to hay. And some of those reasons are, well, when you look at your VFAs, so you compare, they did a comparison of VFAs from forages and VFAs from starch. Now, your starter diets, what are they pretty heavy in? That's starch, right? Okay? So, and obviously, so if you compare your forages and your starch, they actually saw that you get less rumen development from the forages than you do the starches. Okay, so the starches, they said, well, that kind of triggers more of that rumen development. That kind of helps with the process. Okay, so that's why they said, well, don't feed forages, feed more starch, get more starch into their system to help that rumen develop. Okay, another one, when they look at energy. Okay, forages have less energy per unit, okay, than starch. What does that mean? That means a slower digestion, okay? So they said, well, maybe that's a reason that we should feed less of the forages and more of the starch so that we can improve digestion in these calves, okay? So that's another reason. And then one of my favorites that a lot of people talk about a lot, right, is gut fill. You give those calves hay in the pre-weaning phase, they're going to fill their guts with what? Hay. And then they're not going to drink, well, they'll probably still drink their milk, but then they're not going to consume as much starter feed. Okay? So that gut fill also feeds into appetite. Just like, if they consume a lot of forages, then it suppresses their appetite. They're not eating as much of, per se, the starter feed. So in a nutshell, these are some of the reasons. And then there were actually some studies that came out that looked at these things. Now, keep in mind, this one, we're looking at 1962. Okay? So this is some of the literature that came out looking at, and they had some negative results about feeding hay to calves. So in this particular study, they had 3 different groups. Like I said, this is in 1962. Group A got the regular, milk diet. Okay, they didn't get any hay, but they did get some grain. Okay, so they get milk and grain, no hay. And then B, they actually get milk, hay, and grain. So this group B, they also get the hay. Okay, and this is during that pre-weaning phase. Group C got their milk, and then they actually had some VFAs administered to them. Okay, kind of an interesting concept, right? So you're asking how, right? How did they administer these things? Well, I'm a little confused. It's an interesting study. They used stomach tubes and gelatin capsules to administer these VFAs to the calves. Okay, so this is their extra supplementation they're receiving. And the VFAs, keep in mind, that's at the heart of the issue, right? Those are some of the things that they're talking about, if you recall from the previous slide, when we're talking about VFAs and forages versus starches, right? So here we are. We do this. This is actually 2 different calf rumens, okay? This one was the one that was fed, this is group B, where they got the milk, hay, and grain. And this is the one that was just fed milk.
Were they only bottle fed?
Were they only bottle fed?
Milk?
Yeah. And so what's interesting is that I just want you to pick up notes, right? So coloration, right? You see differences in coloration. See differences in texture, right? So keep in mind this darker, more texturized one is the milk, hay, and grain. Well, it includes the hay. And this one's the one that has just mostly milk, no hay, right? Okay. And this is be a little bit tricky to see, but all I want to do is just point out, obviously, so how did they get these rumens, right? They had to sacrifice some animals, and it was a pretty complex system. They did have a little bit of mixture. It was mostly Holsteins, but they also had a couple other breeds in there, like Brown Swiss. And then they sacrificed animals at different ages. So these first couple ones are days, and then, these are in days too. So all the way up to 12 days. Okay? And then they looked at body weight. So this just gives you an idea of the animals, the ages at which they were sacrificed, so they could look at the rumen, look at development. But some of the more interesting results And one of the things that came out of this study was when they looked at the papillae, okay, in the rumen, which obviously the papillae is what really helps facilitate absorption, helps with all those things, right? They're important. So when they looked at the papillae, they measured the number of papillae and per square centimeters. Okay, so how many papillae in a square centimeter? And in the different groups, well, actually, let's focus on the A and B in particular. They did see differences, right? So if you're looking at this, group A, the number of papillae, so you look at age of sacrifice. So there's some animals that are sacrificed 1 to 3 days old, and then you have 4, 8, and 12. Sorry, that's actually weeks. So when you look at that, and you look at the number of papillae in group A, which is your milk, right? No hay, just your milk. And group B, where you have the hay in the diet, what are you seeing? So you add hay to the diet, and what they were concluding from this is that you're seeing fewer papillae. Do you notice that too? Right? And they're saying this is bad, okay? Because if you have less papillae per square centimeter, that means you're going to have more problems with absorption and all of these things. This is a negative impact of hay on rumen development. So this is their case. Okay, so this is what they're saying. Then on top of that, there's another study that came out in 1979. And here they're looking at starter intake and adding roughage to the diet or forages to the diet, okay, for pre-weaned calves. But in this study, they were actually compiling other studies, right? So they were doing kind of an overview of what's out there in the literature in 1979. And what are people seeing, okay? What they came up with, and you can see there's different studies, different number of calves per study, different treatments. So, just kind of comparing. But overall, I want to draw your attention to calf starter intake and then their roughage intake, their hay or roughage intake, okay? And in particular, I highlighted these because even though these are different, there's different treatments in these trials and things. The thing to bring to your attention is the fact that when an animal, because this is another one of the cases we talked about, right? Starter intake versus hay intake. So when an animal is taking in 0.48 kilograms, and then they're not taking in any hay, so they're taking in more starter, no hay. But as your hay intake goes up, your starter intake goes down, right, in general. So these are some of these ideas that people are trying to show. And then as your hay intake goes down, starter intake goes up. Do you see that relationship between those different studies? So all three of those studies had the same conclusions. Starter intake, hay intake, when one goes up, the other goes down. Common sense. But these researchers wanted to show that. They say, listen guys, this is a problem. And that's one of those disadvantages we talked about earlier, right? Is that if you feed more hay, they're not going to eat as much starter. But now, let's think about some of the new research that's come out. So we know about these things, in the past about not feeding hay during pre-weaning. But now we have some new things that are coming out. For example, we have studies that say that calves fed hay during pre-weaning may actually have better performance. And now you're asking what's performance, right? Those are some of the things we'll talk about. But for example, average daily gain. There are some studies that show that offering hay during the pre-weaning phase improves average daily gain. And sometimes that can translate even or carry over into the post-weaning phase, where they're still gaining more during post-weaning, just because they had access to hay during the pre-weaning phase. They're saying that forages could actually help assist with ruminal acidosis. Okay, so if they're taking in a lot of those high concentrate starters, right, their pH, the rumen pH is going down, they might get into an acidosis situation, and they're saying if you have forages available, if you have that in the diet somehow, accessible to the calf, that can help manage any acidosis issues.
So what age are you talking about here?
Well, so these for now, in general. And then we'll get into age into the next ones. And then feeding forage could also improve starter consumption, which is opposite of what we had just looked at before, right? And it might help prevent the buildup of keratin on the papillae in the rumen. So these are some of the ideas that they're coming out with. So let's start with a study in 2012. In this particular study, they had 16 Holstein heifers. They put 8 of them on a diet that had they were offered starter, and then they also had access to grass hay. And then they also had 8 that had access to starter, but no hay. Okay, so you have one group that has hay, one group that doesn't. And then they looked at them post-weaning. So this is during the pre-weaning phase. Right away, I think it was like day 4, these guys have access to grass hay already. Okay? We look at the post-weaning, so they weaned these at about 10 weeks. So post-weaning, greater than 10 weeks and on. Both groups got moved into group pens. Okay, so you put them in a group situation. They had a textured starter. And so textured starter, obviously there's some component of some forages that are included in that starter. And then they had access to ad libitum chopped grass hay. And people talk a lot about particle size, right? So how long what's the length of these particles? Or so these were 1.2 centimeters. And then they wanted to look at what are some of the differences as far as heart girth, wither height, and body barrel. And so body barrel, just to make sure we're on the same page, that was their circumference, right, along the kind of the abdomen midsection before they were fed. Okay, so how did the circumference change? So when you look at these calves post-weaning in 17, no differences in heart girth, no differences in wither height, but they did see a difference in body barrel. And what was that difference? Well, so as you can see, your controls had a significantly smaller body barrel, right? But besides that, they didn't see any differences. So that was kind of interesting. Then from there, they also wanted to look at, what about body weight? Did you see any differences in body weight, right? So you're giving some calves hay, some didn't get hay. Was there any differences post-weaning in their growth? And when they looked at body weight, they didn't see any significant differences, right? So, you have some calves, even though they had a larger body barrel, I mean, it didn't translate. It's not that they were weighing more, right? Yeah, okay. So then what about total dry matter intake? Did that change? So if you have, calves that were raised with hay and calves that didn't have hay, does that translate post-weaning to a difference in dry matter intake? And actually the answer to that is yes, there is a significant difference. And what is that difference? Well, if you follow the line, remember C is for control, and then F means those are the ones that did get the hay, right? So calves that had the hay, all throughout the process, they're always just a little bit above, as far as their intake in dry matter, compared to those that didn't get that hay. So this is even post-weaning, right? So there are some effects that are translating over. What about hay? So, here's the funny thing. If you don't offer hay to a calf pre-weaning, but you want that heifer to eat hay post-weaning, right? So what happens if you offer hay during that pre-weaning phase, or if you don't? How does that translate to hay intake later in life? Well, actually, there's a significant difference between the two. So, once again, C is your control. They don't have access to hay as calves, and these did have access to hay. And they eat more hay when they're then weaned. So this is translating into these, longer term effects. So offering hay as a calf means that most likely when they're weaned, after weaning, they're going to eat more hay. So in conclusion of that study, what they decided is that, if you offer hay to a calf early in its life, it'll increase the forage intake post-weaning. We saw that, right? We saw the hay intake during post-weaning, but that didn't result in a weight difference, right? We didn't see any differences in weight gain. So what if, looking at another study, and this one is actually 2016, okay? So this one, I think it was just actually February 2016 that it got published. They had 45 Holstein bull calves, and they split this up so that, 1/3 or so would get a diet with no hay, and then another group got a diet with 12.5% of alfalfa hay, and that's on a dry matter basis. And the third group would get 25% on a dry matter basis of alfalfa hay during the pre-weaning phase. And they wanted to look at dry matter intake, average daily gain, heart girth, and then that kind of similar to that body barrel, right? The abdominal girth. What did they see? So starting with dry matter intake, we've got our control, which is these white boxes. You've got the diet that had 12.5% of alfalfa hay, and then you have 25% of alfalfa hay, and those are those black circles. And so the only significant differences they saw are where you see these asterisks. Okay? Those are where they saw the differences. So if you're looking at weeks of age, and this is all pre-weaning, you didn't really see a significant difference until week 8. But what do you see then? You see those calves that are getting that 25% of alfalfa hay, dry matter basis, right? They're taking off. They're soaring off on their dry matter intake and kind of leaving these other two groups in the dust, right? But they also wanted to look at average daily gain. So sure, they're eating more, but just because they're eating more, it's not that simple, right? So if you just feed a calf more, it's not just going to grow more automatically. So looking at average daily gain, there's a couple blurps here and there in between, for week 1, 3, and 6. But then what you really see towards the end again, at weeks 8, 9, and 10, who's coming out on top? Who is gaining the most weight? It's those calves that are getting that 25% of alfalfa hay. Interesting, right? So they are eating more, and it is translating to a higher average daily gain. Well, these other two groups, the 12.5% and the control, aren't gaining quite as well. And this one I know is going to be a little tricky to see, but you can count on my words, and hopefully that'll get you through. So, looking at forages and the calf feed intake, some of the things that came out of this when they looked at body weight, they saw a significant difference at final. So remember, they weaned at 10 weeks, so that would be 70 days. So when they took those final body weights, they saw significant differences in who was the heaviest. Well, it was that group that got that 25% of alfalfa hay. And then, of course, in second is the 12.5, and then third is the group that didn't get hay. Okay, and that was a significant difference. What about abdominal girth? This fits that other study that looked at body barrel, right? So once again, those calves that had the higher percentage of hay offered, they had their abdominal girth was larger, just like the body barrel study that we saw, and that was significant. And then heart girth, their heart girth was also significantly larger than the other. Well, not significant from this one, but significant from the control. So they actually pointed out in this study, okay, so if you offer hay from day one, alfalfa hay, it also matters not that you're just offering it, but how much, right? So how much are you offering? And so in conclusion, they did see that there's an increase in starter diet intake on those calves that had hay. they saw an increase in average daily gain. So unlike the previous study, this study actually saw that increase in starter diet intake did translate to heavier calves. But they didn't see a difference in feed efficiency. And now looking at a study from 2015, we have 60 Holstein heifers. Now we're talking about oat hay. Okay, so in this study, there's a group that had oat hay that was supplemented. They only got this oat hay post-weaning, where the other group had this oat hay pre and post. So pre-weaning and post-weaning, they're offered oat hay. They're looking at performance until first breeding. So now we're talking about really long-term effects, right? Now we're talking about reproductive measures. How does this hay translate to later on in life when we're expecting them to get bred quickly, we're expecting them to have good reproductive performance, and ultimately, we want them to produce milk. So what does that first lactation look like? So for this study, first we'll start with their dry matter intake. And so on the left side, you'll see their concentrate and milk replacer dry matter intake. And on the right-hand side is the forage dry matter intake. And this can get kind of messy, right? This bar, so this shows you milk replacer. And obviously they did a step-down approach until the calves were weaned. Okay, so everyone can follow that part. And then you see all these different lines. So you see the concentrate for the control is this line with the black circles and the solid line. Concentrate for the other group, right, that got the oat hay. They have these open circles with the solid line. And then forage. So what is their forage intake? Those are the dashed lines. And then obviously solid would be your control, and then your open would be the ones that had access to the oat hay pre-weaning and post-weaning. So what are we seeing? So as days, these are in days, as they age, as they get older, you see, so the highest amount here, so let's just compare concentrate intake. Who is taking in more concentrate? Oh, sorry, not your control. Your calves that got the oat hay, right? Do you see that difference? So then let's go ahead and compare differences in forage. Keep in mind, these calves, why does that line start there? They didn't have access to oat hay until they got weaned, right? So that's why this line starts here. They get weaned on this day, and finally, these calves have access. Look at how much of a difference that is, though. Because they're getting a lot of a later start, right? And you're gradually seeing those calves that had access to oat hay the whole time, they're gradually increasing in their intake. And by the time you get to day, what is it, about 63, 64, somewhere in there, 65, that is a big difference between those calves. So the ones that had hay from the get-go, they're good to go. They're growing, they're eating hay, they're eating their concentrate. Do you see a big difference in the two groups when it comes to concentrate in that same time frame? No. So that's interesting, because now you're seeing that the calves that had hay from the get-go, they're eating just as much concentrate as the other calves that didn't have hay, but they're also taking in a significant amount more of hay. So let's look at these, because we said we wanted to look at reproduction, we wanted to look at milk production. How did that translate? So we see that the calves that had oat hay from the beginning, they were eating well, they're doing well. What does that translate to here? Nothing. Okay? In a nutshell, there were no significant differences. Okay? I mean, you might see some changes in some numbers a little bit. So age at first service, this would be in days. You know, control group, 405 versus 407. Obviously, it's not much of a difference. 2 days isn't that much of a big deal. Consumption rate for the first service, 53% versus 62%. So the oat hay was a little bit better, but not significant. times bred is pretty similar. All these numbers are pretty close. The culling rate is a decent amount lower than the ones that had out hay at the beginning. But when it came down to how does that translate to later on in life, I didn't see too much for a difference. And then once again, the question comes up about, what about, is there any correlation, right? So this is one of the questions they had. Is there a correlation between average daily gain, so in this case, from 17 days to 65 days of age, okay, so if they're gaining well during that time frame, does that translate to a better first lactation? I don't know, right? So they ran the numbers, and actually they did see this positive relationship where they concluded, yes, typically, now there is a lot of noise though, right? This is not a perfect line. You have a lot of calves that fall below that line and above that line. But in generally speaking, yes, if their average daily gain, the better their average daily gain is during that time frame, the more milk that you'll get. Okay? That should make sense, right? But here's your numbers. So in general, if you offered hay early on in life, in this case it was oat hay, but just in general hay, they saw an increase in starter diet intake, an increase in average daily gain, but they did not see that affect that calf's future capabilities for milk yield or reproduction. Okay? Take home messages. So let's just wrap this all up. Let's take a look at what do these mean? And I have 3 points that I want you to leave with. Okay? First one, offering forages pre-weaning can lead to increases in dry matter intake, starter intake, and average daily gain. So we see some studies that came out with those results. Now you might say, we also saw a study though that saw some opposite of that, right? Improved calf growth during the pre-weaning phase leads to improved future milk yield. So that was that last figure, right? So if the average daily gain is better, you can predict that calf, when she's a cow or her heifer first lactation, you'll get more milk. So that average daily gain is important. Now, I'll pitch this idea out here, but Susan, do you remember one of the key things that the USDA mentioned to us yesterday about average daily gain? How are we doing as a nation on average daily gain?
I don't know if you picked up the handout up there, but it's got some best practices about calf feeding of both colostrum and milk. And it mentions on there that our national goal, the best practice, the thing to achieve is 1.8 pounds per day, and less than 22% of national farms that were engaged in the NOMS study last year averaged that. And less than 22% matched our goal.
Yeah.
But it meant that was an average, so some are achieving more than 1.8 per day, but most are well under.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're thinking that 1.8 pounds per day is the new Holstein's genetic potential. And we're tremendously underfeeding.
So that was one of the take-home messages I got from yesterday, because when we were talking about this, that feeds well into this about your average daily gain and meeting those goals, so that later on you get more milk, right? Your milk yield will be better. Not to mention the benefits of a calf, as far as growth and well-being wise. And so here's the final take-home message. Is there a place for hay, for forages to be fed to calves pre-weaning? Yes. Okay. I think that in the literature there's some good evidence of the benefits of doing that, and I hope you take away some of those messages and think about it. But I'm not recommending that you just go home and just change everything like that, right? I mean, that's something that you should probably talk to your nutritionist about, talk to your veterinarian about, make sure everybody's in agreement. Now, I'm not saying though that it has to be hay, though. I think that there is a place for these textured starters, for example, right? So if you have the ability to get those forages into the calf early on to get them going, I think that's good. So even if you don't want to go back to 1991, 1992 and start offering hay, in those first 2 weeks, that's okay. But maybe to get started, start with a textured starter, get going with that, and then maybe you can start introducing hay, a little bit later in that pre-weaning phase. But so that would be my recommendation. I'm always available for questions, for comments, ideas on, obviously Susan and I are always looking for extension ideas, things that you need. Actually, we're begging for you to call or email us and say, I want to learn about X. And if we're not experts on that, we can find someone that can come in and help you learn about it. So, and thank you for your attention.